Today, an Australia Post victory and beyond. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi Robbie.
Hi Martin.
Great to see you coming back on, and we're trying some new tech which is giving you a very enhanced signal, so it's looking pretty good.
I hope my head's not too shiny.
No, it's a good. And look, it's a very important show this because the Australia Post report came out yesterday from the Senate, right? And boy, it's a spicy read, isn't it?
It is. It is scathing. They've held nothing back. And what that means is it's a real victory for the campaign. We went into this campaign learning as we went along, right? We discovered that the Cartier watches was not the real story, and it just snowballed and became a bigger and bigger campaign and led to this inquiry. And you're always a bit suspicious with these inquiries that the culture of dealing with things in back rooms behind the scenes would come to the fore and suppress the truth. And that's always a worry. But this is a beautiful example of how you can never be so convinced that's going to happen that you don't do anything, because we had hit this so hard, we had left no stone unturned. The inquiry had to cover the issues that we raised, including the big things to do with privatisation, etc., and they did it brilliantly. And they have produced a scathing report that is scathing on the government, scathing on Morrison personally, the ministers, and Australia Post and the board and its chairman. And it's going to lead to a big outcry and demands for reform, which is absolutely necessary.
Absolutely. And it's quite interesting because there was a minority report, right, issued by, wonder which side of the Parliamentary divide would it should issue that, basically saying, well, there's nothing to see here. And of course a statement was put out from ScoMo saying, well, this is a politicised report, etc. But if you read the main report and even Pauline's additional comments, right, it really calls out, I think, a few things. Firstly, that Christine Holgate was impossibly badly treated. It should never have happened, right? That the Prime Minister owes her an apology for the way that it was handled. But also Paul Fletcher, who's in charge ostensibly of Australia Post, came under severe questioning. The chairman of Australia Post basically is suggested he should just disappear, which is probably a good suggestion, seeing what came out, right? And more broadly, the concept that Australia Post should be part of the delivery services for the banks in terms of particularly areas where they're no longer representative, is there as well. So pretty much on all fronts, the things we've been discussing have come through.
Now, it hit the key issues relating to Christine, which is important. But then it hit the structural issues to do with Australia Post. And that sets up a big debate going forward of actually reforming Australia Post, because it's our asset. In fact, Terry McCrann has a scathing column today. And Terry McCrann and Robert, along with Robert Gottliebson, were the two business commentators that had intervened from the beginning to defend Christine Holgate and highlight what a heap of rubbish this scandal about the watches was. But he went right after the government today, based on this report, from the standpoint that this is our asset. And he said an Australian should be furious that this government, this Prime Minister, drove out of the management of our asset the best CEO Australia Post has ever had, right? And it is how the Australian people should see it. So that part is important, and the structural stuff is just as important. In fact, let's just go quickly, Martin, through. I want to highlight a bunch of the recommendations, not all of them. There's 25. And some are more technical than others, but the particular things are worth commenting on. Recommendation number 4, and it recommends an Auditor General investigation of the legality of Communication Minister Paul Fletcher's instruction that the chair stand Christine Holgate aside. Now, this is very consequential, this recommendation, because it pulls back the curtain on a culture, they use that term, but the way business has been done in Australia in this area of the government and government business enterprises. And I criticised this a while ago because you can't have it both ways. There was a wave of corporatisation that started in the 1980s that was a precursor to privatisation, right? And it was all premised on you want to set these entities up that were formerly public services. You want to set these entities up so they're managed professionally, et cetera, right? And of course, most of it was a precursor for privatisation. The Liberals fully intended all along to privatise Australia Post. They never got to do it, but they kept pushing right up to the end, as we know. But if you set it up that way, there's rules about how the government should interact with it, right? The minister just can't bark orders to Australia Post board because it's a corporate, it's an independent entity. But that's what they did. They did it anyway. And they did it in a way that the report highlights was totally unaccountable, right? This was a really cozy thing for the government and its business contacts, etc., where they could stack the board of Australia Post with their Liberal apparatchiks and then dictate to them informally and run the world that way. Well, they got away with it for decades until they used the same method to destroy the best CEO Australia Post ever had, and it's blown up in their face. And now that's under the spotlight. And Paul Fletcher's particular actions, they're recommending an investigation into the legality of those actions. Paul Fletcher has this hanging over his head now. And whereas the government, Martin, may try and block anything in that regard, and the dissenting report indicated they would, bear in mind Christine Holgate has legal action at the moment ongoing, right? At the moment it's in mediation, but if the government doesn't come up with something genuine there, that could quickly go from mediation to full-blown action, in which case the personnel involved, including Paul Fletcher, they will come under scrutiny. Their behaviour will come under scrutiny, and Christine Holgate's legal team now has a Senate inquiry questioning the legality of his actions. Right, that's pretty powerful for that. So that's a very consequential recommendation. Recommendation number 5: the Prime Minister, shareholder ministers, and board apologise to Christine Holgate. Absolutely, they should. That's very important. Recommendation number 6: the Solicitor General investigate the legality of the instruction to stand Christine Holgate aside. That's one of these consequential ones as well. By the way, Martin, you know who the new Solicitor General is?
No, tell me.
Rowena Orr, Miss Orr herself from the Banking Royal Commission. Right. So, yeah, Rowena Orr made a name for herself in the Banking Royal Commission. Right. She got the nickname Shock and Awe because when she got those executives on that stand, she was relentless. Right. And it led to, remember, some of them had physical breakdowns on the stand, all that kind of stuff under her questioning. So she's now the Solicitor General. This recommends look at the legality of the government's involvement here. Recommendation 7, restore the independence of the board, which relates to what I was talking about earlier. Recommendation 8, this is also consequential, restructure the board to include nominees from the House of Representatives, the Senate, the employees, and the licensed post officers. Now, that is actually quite crucial. This is something that we got a sense of early on and started calling for, a restructured board that should have the two biggest stakeholders, actual stakeholders in Australia Post outside the public, are the licensed post officers, who collectively have put up $3 billion of their own money to invest in their business to run our post offices, and of course the employees. It's a big organisation, employs a lot of people, but it's their jobs at stake. So why shouldn't they be on the board having a stake in the decision? And although that may be considered unusual in the way corporate governance works, what's the alternative? What we've got now is a board stacked to the rafters with party apparatchiks, right? So this is a much better improvement. That's a significant recommendation. That's something that both the unions and the licensed post officers will unite behind, that recommendation for sure. Recommendation 13, the chair should resign to accept responsibility for the failings of the organisation with respect to the Holgate matter. Absolutely. He must go. We'll see what happens there. But again, whatever intention he has to weigh up the flow-on effect from this report and the ongoing scrutiny he's going to come under. I'll give you an example. It's actually, there's a section in the report that explicitly questions his honesty in his testimony. Now, we talked about this many times, remember? The chair misleading the Senate. It's going way back to the first hearing after Christine Holgate stood aside. He misled the Senate on the Boston Consulting Group review that he claimed he hadn't seen because he was protecting the government there and keeping it secret. And he misled the Senate on the question of Christine Holgate agreeing to stand aside. She never agreed to stand aside. He claimed she did because they needed to pretend she agreed so they could actually seal it, because they actually had no authority to force her, is the bottom line. And the government had no authority to order it, even though they had. So he was, as Christine said, currying favour with the government by forcing that through to the point where he was prepared to lie about it. This report basically says there's conflicting testimony there. We believe Christine Holgate. We will look at this more. This will be investigated more, and we will look at this more. That goes to what's called the Privileges Committee, Martin, where they look at the people who abuse the question of parliamentary privilege, right? That's hanging over his head. And when he weighs all that up, maybe will decide it's in my interest to get the hell out of here, right? That really is a no-brainer. Right now, no one has any confidence in Australia Post under his chairmanship. Recommendation 14, which is the one you just talked about. This is brilliant. All banks should be required to allow Australia Post to serve their customers and pay to cover the cost of that as part of their banking license. This is a halfway step to a postal bank. Remember, the deal that Christine Holgate achieved with the banks, for which she awarded the Cartier watches to the executives who worked so hard on it, was with 3 of the 4 big banks. ANZ refused to deal. And because ANZ refused to deal, ANZ customers can't bank at the post office anymore, right? Because she said, no, you're going to pay now to do that. We were losing money before serving your customers. Now you're going to pay. And ANZ refused to do it. So she couldn't let them off the hook. She had to cut off their customers. This recommendation says the APRA should basically make this a requirement of the banking license. If you're going to be an ADI in Australia, part of that means you are going to have to allow Australia Post to serve your customers and pay their costs for doing so. All right, so that will mean that there doesn't have to be any recurring negotiations with the banks to continue the deal. Because if the banks ever pulled out of this deal, the LPOs would be back to where they started, right? They would be on their knees again. This deal is what makes them viable. So that's an excellent recommendation there. Number 16 is the government should immediately release the secret Boston Consulting Group review in full, which is exactly what should be done. Number 17, the government should expressly rule out privatising Australia Post in whole or part, and certainly verbally they've done that, right? Let me just state it now, Martin. The single greatest achievement of this campaign is to stop the privatisation agenda against Australia Post. There was there was a privatisation agenda. This has been, even now, I am getting feedback from the best connected sources that this is absolutely what was happening. And by exposing it, we have them all running for the hills. No one wants to be seen to have any association with privatisation at all. And can I say, for the viewers' benefit, but the first substantial examination of that question was on this program. Yep. DFA. You and I talked about it, did a show on it. I wrote an article for our publication. We did a press release. We got it out, but I had pulled together a fair amount of the evidence. I consulted you. because of your experience, you had insights into Boston consulting and that whole world because of your background. You were able to confirm some things. We then put out a show about it. That show set up the process of everyone starting to see this really was a big issue. We have now stopped it. Right, that is the most definitive achievement of this campaign. So pat yourself on the back, Martin, and your viewers.
Absolutely.
And then just one more, recommendation 23, the government should work with all Australia Post stakeholders to find new ways to support licensed post offices and regional communities. And that's a bit of goodwill there on behalf of the committee who through this process have learned to appreciate even more the importance of the licensed post offices. I've told the licensed post offices the reason this campaign succeeded is because, we played a very important role, but essentially what we were doing is through our efforts to publicise the issues, we were getting the Australian public to see this issue through the licensed post officer's eyes. They knew they had the best insight of anybody because they have been struggling with this organisation for decades and decades and decades. And it was from their perspective that they saw the massive difference Christine Holgate made. They then were witness to the vicious blowback she was getting even before the watchers actually, right? They saw the undermining of her, right? But from their standpoint, they knew that, for 3 years they were able to get sleep at night because they were able to stop worrying about going broke, and she made that happen. And then when she was crucified for it, they're the ones who, were intensely loyal because they weren't going to, allow a rewriting of history where such a great leader could be brought down over 4 watches, by politicians with clearly ulterior motives, right? And they stuck to their guns. People like me came to see that, learnt their side of it and publicised it, and that set off a campaign that just snowballed into a very effective inquiry, laid bare a lot of things, and now this excellent report.
Yeah, and it's worth just reflecting, and so often I hear people saying, well, there's no point in getting involved, there's no point in engaging with the politicians because they've just got their own agenda, they never listen to anybody, right? This is a classic example. If you needed more examples, right, look at the cash man. When you actually get motivated, get activated, and start pushing on things that fundamentally need to be changed, you can make a difference, right? And I think that everybody on your side of the fence and my side of the fence and everywhere else, a lot of people were involved, but it was the mutual reinforcement of all those messages and the activation into Canberra that made the difference. And that is democracy in action.
It is. And, it's the people who have played an instrumental role in this report are a different cast of characters to the ones who, for instance, made sure the cash ban was killed off. The public is the same. It was public effort, but this report was essentially the work of, there's a committee representing all parties, but this was the Greens, Labor, and Pauline Hanson produced this report, right? Whereas in the cash ban, it was National Party and Backbench Liberal Party people that had responded to the public campaign around that. Anyway, so you can't just go by sort of your perceptions of the political stripes of the entities involved and convince yourself beforehand that, you're not going to be able to get them to do the right thing, right? No, it's just not true. And in fact, the chair of this committee, who is essentially the person who has made sure this report is written as it is Sarah Hanson-Young, the Greens senator. Now, I shouldn't have to tell any viewers who Sarah Hanson-Young is. She's probably the most notorious of all the Greens in the Parliament. She's the biggest whipping girl, right? People either love her or hate her. She's a very polarising figure. The day Christine Holgate was crucified over these watches, Martin, she jumped on the bandwagon too. She was condemning her in the loudest possible terms, right? Yep. The difference is she was just responding to the furor around, public entities spending taxpayer money on luxury watches, etc. And she was whipped up in that and made a comment on it, as most people would on the day. She wasn't, however, under the thumb of the vested interests that had set this up, like people in the Liberal Party and Labor Party were. She then gets, the campaign, because the public gets behind it, allowed people like her to get a different perspective on what had actually happened, right? And, she quickly shifted or eventually shifted her position to be able to run a pretty decent inquiry and produce this report, right? So that's, you don't have any kind of preconceptions about this process. If you know that the principle that you're taking up the fight on is right, and you do the work, make sure you're informed. Don't just be based on political gossip. There's a lot of gossip out there on the internet. I think we were so focused on this issue that through our weekly show we were giving people more updates every day and every week, etc. We were learning things and reporting what we were learning. We weren't just putting out internet gossip. We had actual verified facts that we were getting people to understand and then act on. That quality of information is very important, right? And that's what then becomes an undeniable factor when you're presenting that to the powers that be, and the ones who see the truth in that are then prepared to, because they see it's not just the truth, but there's this public support behind it, are therefore prepared. You'll find people that are prepared to do things that otherwise you might be surprised that they would even consider, Can I just say though, Martin, I've got to make a comment about Bridget McKenzie. I think on your show, I have given fulsome praise to Bridget McKenzie, right? National Party Senator Bridget McKenzie. And I don't want to withdraw that fulsome praise. I seriously don't. She played a very important role in the inquiry. You showed the clips on your show of her actually going to taking first Senator Jane Hume to task, and then Liberal Party Senator Sarah Henderson. So she was prepared to cross swords with her own coalition colleagues in the actual hearings. But because she's in the coalition, there is a dissenting report in this report at the end, which is essentially the coalition saying to all these 25 recommendations which ones they support, which ones they don't. And for the key ones that I've just gone through, it's essentially, no, they're just going to protect Lucio, the chair, and the government, Scott Morrison, nothing to see here, move on kind of thing. And Bridget McKenzie's name is on that dissenting report. And if you read it all, I know half of it she doesn't agree with, right? She's been forced to eat dog crap to put a name on this thing because she's in the coalition, right? So even though that's the most negative part of the report, the irony is her personal role in the hearings was as effective as anybody in producing the content that contradicts what's in that dissenting report. And a lot of the actual substance of the report that goes through the evidence that came out of the hearings is from the line of questioning that Senator Bridget McKenzie pursued. She's responsible for a lot of the excellent substance of this report. Yet, out of party loyalty, coalition loyalty, she has to toe the line and put a name to something half which she doesn't agree with. That's a good reason why it's good to have minor parties in Parliament.
No, I agree with that. And of course, you have to recognise that the political machinery is still very powerful, right? And it pushes people to do things that, at their heart they probably know isn't the right thing to do, but they're sort of caught within the system, right? So I think the small parties, do play an important part, but also the force of the public expressing their views, the phone calls that were made, the submissions that were made, those count for a lot when it actually, comes to the bottom line. I think the other point I want to make, Robbie, is if you go back, a few months to when this thing started out, the mainstream media were nowhere, right? They basically just picked up the superficial story, and we discussed in a previous show the pretty disgusting cartoons and things, right? It wasn't until people started to understand that there was more to this, but that didn't happen from the mainstream media initially, did it?
No, I mean that's I'm very happy with the coverage it's getting now. A lot of positive coverage overnight. Most of your viewers might have seen some of that at least. This has made waves. The general tenor of the coverage is sympathetic to Christine Holgate, as it absolutely should be. But yeah, where were they when it mattered? Right? That's what I want to know. And, I got a call last night from a journalist from a national television station asking me details to do with the way all this came about in terms of the original attack, etc. Why did it happen in the first place? In other words, this journo who called me last night was asking questions that should have been asked on the 22nd of October.
Yep.
Instead, she was asking them on the 26th of May 2021, right? Where were they then? The questions were there to be asked, right? The Prime Minister had just looked like a total hysteric in the Parliament over this issue. And did anybody bother to say, when were the watches bought? What were the watches for? And because these are the two things that made Christine Holgate refuse to stand aside. She knew that not only had she done nothing wrong legally by the rules, etc., this was the best thing she'd ever achieved in public service. All right, this is a world-renowned CEO. This is a woman who's been named best CEO in Australia before, right? She had 3 years of public service out of the private sector in the public service, looking after a public entity. And in those 3 years, and she did a very good job, and in those 3 years, she had one achievement that stood above all others, and it was this banking deal. She'd done a deal with the banks that had saved the licensed post offices, right? That had saved regional banking services, for which she and Australia Post were so excited they wanted to award the people who did the deal, and they awarded them with these watches. She knew that was the context, and she knew that if she'd done it 2 years earlier, she hadn't just done it in the middle of a pandemic, wandered down the street to go to Cartier and say, how can I throw around taxpayers' money today while people are being laid off and in lockdown and whatever. No, she hadn't done that. She'd done it 2 years earlier. Those are the things she knew. And they were the two obvious facts that if anybody had have reported it at the time would have left most people scratching their head. They didn't bother. Right? The media just went a lot. There's a outrage machine we've talked about. The politicians try to appeal to it. The media want to keep it because this is a big way they maintain their control over the political process. They can push the buttons of this outrage machine and scare everybody. And so this was ordinary people, the plucky little 3,000 licensed post officers, the Citizens Party, the first politician to actually not care about how he was viewed and actually stand up for Christine over the watches was Bob Katter early on. And then, a month or so later, Barnaby Joyce spoke up. Eventually, once Pauline Hanson got involved, she was really good. Public opinion shifted there. But the media had deserved no credit in this at all, right? So take that as a lesson. One, don't give the media too much credit. Two, but realise you don't need to think in terms of, if they're not going to cover it, no one else is. No, we can turn around public opinion if it's the right issue.
Absolutely, Robbie. Well, it's a very important event, a very successful outcome, and it's worth just underscoring again: privatisation is not automatic, right? Privatisation is still a Liberal Party agenda, but it is not necessarily a good strategy. And, there are other examples I think that we can probably talk about on another occasion, which may be in the wind as well. The point is Australia Post will stay in public hands. The chances are now that we might even see it developing in line with what Christine was thinking about, despite the fact that Christine won't be there personally. She's left, will leave an indelible mark on the future of Australia Post and on Australian politics. So kudos to her. And I'm going to end this show in a few moments with just a very brief snippet from her 7:30 interview last night, which I think sums up very nicely the end state we've got to. But Robbie, very important show this. Thanks very much for all the stuff that you've been driving throughout this, because you've been the prime mover from the CC. And let's keep the story going. But remember, folks, this is just one example of how we can influence politics and political outcomes by getting involved and pushing really hard on the right issues with knowledge, with experience, and using the weight of public opinion in our favour.
And watch this space, because there will be action now on the Australia Post Bank front. There is widespread support for it in Parliament. Politicians are considering introducing legislation for an Australia Post Bank. We've been working very heavily on that, and there will be some action on that front. So we'll report that as there's developments in that area, because as there are developments, we're going to need the public to get behind that. Contact all the politicians, etc., and say you guys should support this, so this can actually be legislated, right? So these are those things that in her 3 years, Christine showed the potential of Australia Post. We can now realise that potential. Yes, she has moved on. She ultimately had to make a decision that was right for her family. You got to appreciate she went through some. I mentioned this on our show last week. She went through into some very dark places because of what was done to her. She was, the campaign really brought her back, etc. And she's thrilled with, no doubt, with how this has developed. But it's clear from the dissenting report the government is dug in. Though they're not going to reinstate her. She had this job offer she had to take. She has to care about the fact that her family is concerned about her mental health, and naturally they're not going to be that keen on her being too exposed to this kind of nasty nest of vipers in Parliament anymore. So she's made the right decision. But my point is, she did her bit to save Australia Post. She saved Australia Post through her 3 years of managing it and showing that potential, getting in the way of the privatisation agenda. It's now the public knows about this because of the scandal. It's our responsibility, and there's lots of things we can do in that area going forward. That's the beyond question, Australia Post and beyond. So stay tuned. We'll report the developments and be prepared to get behind them.
Absolutely, Robbie. Well, thanks for your time today. As always, really appreciate it. And here's to the next battle ahead. We know the playbook now. We know what we can do. We know the power of social media, the power of getting well informed and then sharing that information. And, the playbook will come out again.
Yep. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely, delightedly. And I'm so grateful for the Senate Committee for all the hard work they've done and for all the incredible support I've had, from many different people, especially the post offices. Well, I haven't heard from the Prime Minister yet, but I'd welcome an apology. And I think it's a really important thing, Lee, that sometimes when things go wrong, if we apologise, people can heal and move on. And for me, this is not just about me. It's because I stood up for something. And it's actually really important for all the people, for all the employees of Australia Post, for all the people who've backed them. So I would welcome that apology and I would graciously accept it. Well, I think what's really important is that people do stand up to workplace bullying. And after I was on the 7:30 report last time with Laura, so many people wrote to me, and actually men as well as women, telling me about their stories. So a lot of people feel they can't stand up, and I hope this gives them the courage to stand up. And I've questioned myself, Lee, many times in this process because it is challenging. But my gosh, when you see the Senate take such forensic, approach to this and to tell the truth and seek the truth, I think it should give everybody hope.